Hi, Nathan. Welcome to the Be Fearless podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Nathan, let's begin with the origin story, right? I mean, you've been in cybersecurity for such a long time. Take us, all the way back of when you started with cybersecurity. How did you fall in love with it? What were those string of events which made it happen?
That's an interesting story because I grew up in a very rural area, and we didn't really have computers around. My first exposure to computers, actually, it was in grade school. I guess that would have been the 80s sometime. I don't know.
Okay.
And we had an Apple IIc, and I was able to play with Logo, but very limited interaction. It wasn't until I joined the military that I was more exposed. So we're talking around 1995. And, one time I was on deployment and my boss had some video games loaded on the computer and he wouldn't let me play them. And they were using a security product to lock down the system. So it was Windows 3.1, so there is no security. But there was this program that acted like a security program called Menu Set. And depending on your permissions level, it allowed you to do certain things. So I was able to figure out, I needed to figure out how this thing worked. So I kind of ended up deconstructing it a bit, and I found out that I could get to a DOS shell through WordPerfect. So pre MS Word days. So I got to a DOS shell and I found the configuration file, and I noticed that his name had a 9 and mine had a 3. So I decided to swap the values. Next thing you know, I was playing Duke Nukem 3D and Doom 2. And from that point on, I found that fascinating that it was almost like playing a video game, like breaking into these systems was kind of a video game. And so, of course, made him very mad because he couldn't play video games. And he's like, okay, you can play video games if you just tell me how it works. And I knew didn't matter what he did, I could always get in and change it anyway. But that kind of set me on a path of, this is kind of fun. What else can I do with this system? So I started, kind of digging into it from there. It was probably I can't remember what year it was I was exposed to Linux. So, I had to compile my own SB Live driver to get audio to come out of my system and stuff like that. And I started going to meetups and meeting people. So there was the rebooting of the 2600 that happened in my city, and really meeting other people who had the same interests and were willing to bring laptops in public and, work on security challenges. And that's kind of what set me on my path.
Okay, fantastic. I mean, I still remember those dreadful days where you had to sit down and try to compile drivers for,
Yes.
various devices on Linux and...
configure, make, install.
Yeah. So from there, take us through the story about what are the different fields that you looked at from a cybersecurity perspective? How did you start at DEF CON, Black Hat? What were some of the early talks and how did that evolve over the years, research that you did?
Sure. So I've been speaking publicly at conferences since, I think, 2003 may have been my first security conference. And throughout the years, it's really run the gambit. So it's whatever I was kind of interested in or solving problems at the time. So I've even done quote unquote boring talks on security awareness to super cool talks where I've discovered new vulnerability classes and pretty much everything in between. So where most people know me from is I am fascinated about security at the intersection of humanity and technology.
Right.
So back in 2008, I was part of delivering a very popular talk called Satan is on My Friends List. So back in 2008, it was, MySpace was the biggest social, that's back when we called them social networks instead of social media. And Facebook was still relatively new, but people, it was out there. So it's like, hey, this is an interesting attack surface. And because that seemed to be where the people were going, people were spending more time on these platforms. And we made jokes about MySpace basically being an updated version of GeoCities. And that was just fascinating to me that people would spend a bunch of time on this platform and they had developers and they had SDKs and none of them had any security. And they were making very obvious mistakes that we should have learned, because that's kind of like a theme of mine throughout the years is like, we've already learned these lessons. Like, why are we still going down this path?
Right. And from there, Nathan, I know that right now you're chairing the whole AI track at Black Hat.
Yep.
how do you start off with the whole machine learning and AI? I mean, now I know it's almost like everybody's doing AI, everything has AI and whatnot. But yeah, just take us through that.
Sure. So once again, that how I got started was through kind of frustration, right? So there was a certain year, and I don't remember what year it was. It may have been like 2015, 2016, something like that, where I walked through the vendor area at Black Hat, and every booth, regardless of what product it was, said machine learning. Everything was machine learning. And I wanted to be able to kind of call that out. I wanted to be able to say, hey, look, you're using machine learning to define a file name, and none of your other products, none of the other part of your products are using this. But it just seemed like something was happening. So that kind of set me on a path to doing things like even simple tasks. So things like, even logistic regression or a random forest, and like playing around with scikit-learn and, doing things with pandas, just doing some data analysis with pandas. So in the early days of machine learning, or if you're doing actual machine learning things in scikit-learn, you have to make sure your data's in the right format. You can't just take a bunch of garbage and hope that it spits something out. So the more I kind of learned, I'm like, okay, well, that's kind of cool. You can do that with this. And it was mostly just kind of playing around, doing things for work. So in the early days, it wasn't about attacking any of these things. It was about trying to solve problems with them. So we have a bunch of data. Is there anything we can do with this data? Can we get any insights out of it? Right. And of course, that transitioned very quickly, especially the past few years, into more security aspects. So how is your attack surface changing? What can you do to limit that attack surface? And what steps should you be doing? So the guidance around a lot of these systems is usually a little fraught because so if you remember adversarial examples in the computer vision space, a lot of the mitigations make the model unusable. And in the end, you have to say, well, what am I really trying to protect myself from? Is this really a legitimate attack I need to be worried about? So I try to help people understand like the difference between like a real attack, something they should be worried about, or a use case where it's like, yeah, if it gets attacked, that's too bad, but it's, it's not going to result in anything, super damaging, and help them kind of prioritize, those efforts and help them understand the risk. So.
And in the AI track at Black Hat, what kind of submissions are you getting? And also, if you can just elaborate on what kind of submissions would you ideally want to see?
Okay, that's a great question. So I think the kinds of submissions we're getting are just about anything you could imagine. But the AI track is a little bit, it has to be a little bit broad, right? So it's not a track about attacking AI. It's not a track about defending AI. And it's not a track about applying AI to security problems. It's all three. So you really have to balance that out, right? Like, so you have to say, we need a certain number of submissions of each to try to balance out the content. And I think I was pleasantly surprised because normally it's there's usually a pretty clear cutoff between a good submission and a poor submission. But the submissions were actually a lot better this year.
Okay.
I don't know what it was, but I noticed the kind of the quality was going up. It's kind of hard to say what are you looking for in a talk. Obviously, with those three things in mind, I always kind of talk about the actionable aspect. Attendees Black Hat is an applied security conference. Right. So giving attendees, content that they can go back to work and try to put to use is what's most important. So if that's attacking something, it's going to put a new tool in their toolkit. Yeah. If it's about applying to a security problem, then it's about giving them some idea or a roadmap of how they can do that in their own organization.
I'm sure all the talks this year were amazing. Any specific talk that got you excited?
Yeah, so Rich Harang's talk from NVIDIA was a very great practical talk. He did a talk on, I forget what the exact title was. It's I've been in Vegas almost a week now, but it was on lessons learned from a year in the trenches with LLM security, and he kind of broke down what he was seeing, what kinds of vulnerabilities he was seeing, and kind of talked about mitigation strategies for those. some of the other talks, I haven't been able to view them yet because I was running around with my own stuff. But there was a couple on like reinforcement learning that I thought were super interesting. One on resilient cyber defense using reinforcement learning. So one thing that I at least try to do is, I know LLMs are really popular right now, but just having an entire AI track filled with LLM talks isn't going to be super useful to people who are trying to solve problems. So really, we tried to keep the perspectives a little diverse. We did have 2 RL talks, reinforcement learning talks. So maybe we had one too many, but they were both really solid. And one was focused on attacks, and one was focused on defense. So even though they were both on reinforcement learning, they both had a different perspective.
Okay. And Nathan, day to day, what does work look like? What are different things that you're working on? Very curious to know a little bit about that.
Sure. So I lead a fundamental and applied research team for a cybersecurity company called Kudelski Security. And what my team does is focus on emerging technologies. So basically all of the buzzwords. So we are the buzzword shop. And it's really about, and anybody who's read my writing or follows me will know that I despise hype. I don't think it's helpful for anybody. So we never hype anything. We always try to break things down. We always try to provide the best advice around things. But usually AI security, quantum security, privacy preserving technologies, these types of things are things that we're working on. And we incubate new products and services for our company. So
interesting.
New intellectual property, new approaches, patents, all kinds of things like that.
I mean, you were telling me that you've been doing some interesting research around AI, applications on certain things. I mean, I know some of the stuff you of course don't want to reveal, but can you give the audience a little bit of insight on what is that you're working on? Yeah.
So this is kind of I mentioned earlier that I'm fascinated by the intersection of technology and humanity, and mainly because every single time a new technology comes along, people try to use it to solve a social or societal issue, which is not really what they're meant to do. But I've been fascinated with the impact of using personal AI assistants on cognitive capabilities. So we kind of know that humans naturally do something called cognitive offloading. So if you give a human a shortcut, they're going to follow it. A perfect example of that is what GPS has done to humans' ability to navigate. So you find that there are these strange effects when you start using tools like that happen to you that you didn't think would happen. You think, oh, well, I can always just drive there. I can use a map, right? So I'm not really losing anything. But come to find out, it has a really strange effect on our spatial awareness. So even outside of navigation, our spatial awareness is impacted. And what I've kind of found out is that some of these processes like GPS or even a calculator to a certain extent competes with our cognitive capabilities. So it's competitive instead of assistive. So I've kind of been breaking those down into categories and kind of trying to extrapolate what the effects might be of having systems plan everything for us, or wanting to be 100% certain about some sort of decision. So I released some earlier this year. I released some new safety criteria, or things that I think are related to safety of these products and things that need to be built into them to be safe to use. And I'm about to release at some point here, whenever I find the time, the personas that people will use with these tools. And it kind of gives you an idea of what kind of illusions that will create. So
you bring up a good point, right? Even sometimes I wonder, all the GPS that we end up using, all the maps that we end up using, when you're right, the whole sense of spatial awareness, or even being able to figure out, direction and all of that, starts to diminish. Now it's almost the moment I walk out, I immediately will open up a Google Maps or just depend on, Uber to get me a ride somewhere.
Now, which way is north?
Yeah. Is this
I mean, I think 100 years ago, if we were in this building and we were talking to each other like this, we would both be able to point which way is north. It was something naturally kind of built into us. It's I remember I took 3 turns. It was almost subconscious. Right. But now with all the tools that we use and all the distractions that we have, we don't really pay attention. There's so many people who walk around here and they take 3 turns and then they look around and it's well, I don't know where I'm at now.
Right.
So
I can totally correlate. One of the other questions I had for you is, now, of course, AI is pretty much in everything, cybersecurity as well, both from the defense and offense perspective, right? I mean, we were giving a talk on breaking secure web gateways, and one of the things I mentioned was the entire code was actually written by one of our interns with the help of LLMs. Because we also wanted to prove that this is how easy it is starting to become even for attackers.
Yep.
But now, as this starts to compound, as technology starts to compound, how do you think cybersecurity is kind of like going to change?
So that's a good question. I think, so with the LLMs and with it being related to code, so if we take a step back, like I kind of mentioned that I am a big fan of using what we already know, right? And applying it to these emerging technologies. So we seem to throw out the rule book every single time one of these technologies comes along. But even in the coding space, I think it's important to think about how that changes the task at hand. So if you're doing a bunch of code generation, that means you need to do more testing, right? So you're going to have to do more functional testing. Like, are these functions that are being written, do they actually work the way we think they do? So I ran into a situation a couple of years ago where there was a function for a financial application where the equality operator was in the wrong direction. Somebody's going to lose money. But if they would have had simple functional tests, they would have caught that.
Right.
And I think what we'll kind of see here is, like, as these tools write more code, it doesn't remove the human from, because, I mean, developers do more than just bang away on a keyboard writing code, but I think it will put more of an emphasis on software testing.
Right.
And testing is something security people know how to do. So, I think there's always going to be a role for security. Another interesting thing is every single new technology brings a new unintended attack surface. And sometimes it takes a while for that to kind of shake out. So perfect example, I think I said this last year on stage at Black Hat, was like, I asked how many people, have heard of like AlphaGo and these superhuman Go machines that beat the best people in the world. And then I said, well, how many people have heard of the work that Stuart Russell's lab has done on adversarial policies? Because nowadays, an average Go player can beat all of these superhuman Go AIs. So new attacks will always be there. We're not going to develop the perfect technology. And I think it's incumbent upon security professionals to be a bit agile and to keep an open mind when thinking about these things.
Okay. And kind of shifting left in the sense that, developers play a very big part in this, right?
Correct, yep.
And that is really where, you were briefly mentioning about, some of the work that you're doing, speaking at developer conferences, talking about different topics. Could you elaborate a bit on that?
Sure. So I've never liked this blame the developer thing. So I still see, it's 2024 and I still see people making public comment about crappy developers or whatever. And it's just because they've never done their job. Like, just because a security person can write like 5 lines of Python code, that doesn't make you a developer. Like, they have they're incentivized differently. They have different problems that they're dealing with than security people do. And a lot of times security people will drop a report on a desk and say, see you later. And they assume that they know what's happening. So I like speaking at developer conferences because it puts you in front of the people and they can see that I'm not one of these people blaming them for problems like that. I understand where you're coming from. So I'm doing a keynote coming up at Agile DevOps USA, and it's called Using What We Already Know to Protect the Future. Yeah. So kind of talking like, hey, you don't need to throw out all your rule books. Like, you've learned things. Here's how it applies, So I really like that type of a theme because I think it gives people a lot of hope. And so it might surprise people to hear me talking about hopeful stuff, since if you're aware of my writing, I spend a lot of time dispelling myths and kind of addressing issues. So it looks like I'm kind of negative on technology sometimes, but I'm fighting against the hype and not against the technology itself. So maybe I should be more positive in my message. So.
And this year at DEF CON, right, it's like brand new for everybody. This is the very first time it's all happening in a convention center. So how has your experience been?
So it's different. I like the fact that everything's under one roof, which, in the past few years, you never knew where a village was in a hotel, or it was here, how far away, and it took forever to walk. And then if you go there and you don't want to see what you see, then you have to walk all the way back. So I think that aspect is nice. I think the layout could use some work a bit. But so far, so good. I mean, I'm not hating on it. It seems nice. I like that I can go to one place and take it all in.
Which are some of the newer technologies that is getting you excited that you're planning to work on probably in the next year, 2 years?
Well, so the LLM thing isn't going anywhere anytime soon. So there's some interesting trends that are happening that kind of show that the hype is dying down. I mean, there's some changes in some investments, and there's a little bit of uncertainty there. The tools the way they are, they're certainly not magic, but they're useful for some things. So I am always looking at things from an offensive perspective. So probably diving more into some of those areas, as well as, internally to our organization, working on new products and new features to enable to make our employees' life easier and better. Because nothing is worse than being drowned in alerts or not having the right tools when a situation comes up. So I really want to make that easier for our employees and kind of empower them to make the best decisions they can make under any given circumstance. So I think it's what I'm looking forward to in the next year is a lot of doing, or at least I hope. We'll see.
Okay. And at the very end, I'm going to ask you a very cliche question.
Okay.
Which is, of course, with cybersecurity evolving, and you look at the crowd, so many young folks who are just coming in.
Yep.
Some of them, of course, genuinely probably want to do something in cybersecurity. Some of them now, because cybersecurity is mainstream, maybe there are good jobs and all of that.
Yeah.
But for someone trying to enter into cybersecurity in this day and age, with all the stuff happening, with AI, machine learning, so many different things, what would be your advice?
So I'm a big fan of asking somebody who recently did it, because, obviously those of us who have been around for a long time, the paths that were open to us aren't
Very
open
true.
anymore.
Very
I think so to have a little bit more of a pessimistic message, then I'll get to the optimism part. So I don't think we've really considered how, even if part of the promises of LLMs comes into being, what people are hoping to do is eliminate entry-level jobs.
Right.
So if you eliminate tier 1 analysts, or even if you eliminate, junior developers, where are those people going to get the experience to become a senior developer?
Yeah.
So I don't think we really thought about that. We're looking at optimizing everything, and so I think there's that people coming in now are going to be much more challenged than those of us who started a long time ago. And once again, it kind of goes back to being agile, talking to the right people, and maybe even having to work even harder, because you're going to have obstacles to overcome that those of us who have been doing this for a long time never had. So that being said, security professionals are not in danger anytime soon. Neither are developers, right? Yeah. So there's always those roles. So I would engage in the community. So we're here at DEF CON. Not everybody can make it to DEF CON, but a lot of local meetups, things like 2600, DEF CON groups, city secs in different cities, and go to those meetups and talk to people who are doing it. It'll open doors. If there is a position, so I think most positions never make it to a job board. It's somebody knows somebody, and how you get in, how you open those doors as you go out, you meet people, you network, and it'll do wonders. And people will show you stuff. People are happy to explain. I mean, most security professionals love talking about their job, so I would soak all of that in, and just keep in mind, maybe I'm giving bad advice because I've done this for so long, but I mean, I think agility is something that needs to be practiced, and networking is always a good idea. I mean, whether it's directly helpful or indirectly helpful.
Absolutely. And you're right. Entering into cybersecurity, especially many of us who are probably a little bit more introverted, always kind of go back into our little cave, do research. It's very difficult at times to kind of break through that shell, at least I found it very difficult in the early years. Slowly started to learn that, hey, the more you network, the more opportunities open up, because people tend to remember who they meet, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I'm a little introverted too, but at a security conference, I mean, we all at least have something in common.
Right.
So it makes it easier to have those conversations. It makes it easier to approach people when you at least have that in common. So if you just went out into the street and met a random person, you might not have much in common with them, but at least here or at one of these meetups, there's always somebody who has something in common with you. So it's a nice icebreaker.
Absolutely. So Nathan, apart from the keynote, you're doing any other interesting conferences that you're participating in this year?
Let's see. Well, most of them. Well, Black Hat was the big one, so that's what kind of took up my time. I'm doing an event in Switzerland for my company. So I'm working on some guidance right now for security leaders around generative AI.
Okay.
Obviously, no hype involved, and what I'm taking a bit of a different approach to it. So rather than saying, "Oh, here are a bunch of use cases," what I want to do is give CISOs a thought process for how to approach these problems. Because if you swap out the LLM technology with something brand new that we don't even know, I want to give them a framework for thinking about these things in a way that will be beneficial for them over the test of time. Because if I just say, "Hey, look, you can use this for threat intelligence," and I show them something, also it's really hard to do that too, because with generative AI, people thought that you didn't have to have your data house in order for some reason. I don't know why they thought that. So they're kind of finding that there's things they want to do with the technology, but maybe they have conflicting information in their vector database, or their data quality is very poor. So you're going to get very poor results from that. So these are the types of things I don't think people really think about. So they do a quick POC and they're like, "This is garbage, I'm not doing this." Where if they would have spent a bit more time and they would have thought about it, getting your data house in order is a good thing to do regardless of technology, because it's going to open a lot more doors for you if you have good data, if it's in the appropriate format, if it's stored in one place instead of 10,000 places. These are good things to do anyway.
And I mean, you bring up Switzerland, very tangential comment from my side. My entire career in Wi-Fi security started because of Switzerland.
Oh, did it?
So interestingly, in 2003, I was a student in India. And at that point in time, there were no laptops, no Wi-Fi, nothing was there in India. And I applied for a foreign internship to like 300 places. There's this university south of Zurich in Rapperswil. I don't know if you've ever gone to Rapperswil. Called Hochschule for Technik Rapperswil.
Oh, okay.
And there was this professor over there, I still remember his name, Beat Stettler. And he said, "Hey Vivek, come down and maybe you can do something in Wi-Fi security." So I go to that university for the very first time in my whole life, see a laptop. I'm given a few PCM-CIA cards, and it takes me a bit to actually figure out that there are slots, because the slots were covered that you had to put it in. So anyway, brings back very fond memories.
Did you, okay, so here's the real question about that. Was it an Orinoco Gold card or was it a Proxim card?
They had a bunch of those,
well, I guess
including the
Proxim
Cisco
was
Aeronet ones.
Cisco Aeronet, okay. I guess Proxim did make the Orinoco, maybe my memory's good.
Yeah.
What was the other one that had the extended range? Anyway, now we're going off on a tangent.
I forget, but you remember those times when we literally had to figure out the right driver so that you could put it in monitor mode.
Exactly, yeah.
And had to always recompile those drivers and whatnot. Anyway, it's a totally tangential comment.
But it brought back some nice memories. I still remember the guy with his hand raised on the Orinoco card.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks so much, Nathan.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
For being on the show, and thanks so much for doing so much for the community.
No, you're very welcome.
Yeah, look forward to probably speaking with you next year once again.
Yeah, that would be great.
Thank you so much.
Right,
Thanks.
Thanks.